Hey guys, this is Jimmy coming at you with another series of Royal Rumble reviews for you guys today. Now, in this video, I'm going to be taking a look back on the 2014 Royal Rumble event, which was held at the CONSOL Energy Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, this would mark the final WWE pay-per-view in the traditional sense of things, as the following month later, being Elimination Chamber, would mark the first WWE pay-per-view to also be featured on the then newly launched WWE Network, a streaming service that's been around ever since. So, gone were the days of having to contact your local cable provider in order to order a WWE pay-per-view. I mean, some of them you could still do now, but with the inclusion of the WWE Network, especially when it came to having to pay that monthly subscription fee as a more of a cheaper price compared to having to pay like let's say like $49.99 on a B level pay per view, or in this case with WrestleMania being like $60, But with the inclusion of the WWE Network, you get that sort of monthly subscription fee for a much cheaper price in order to gain access to some of their featured content, especially with the pay-per-views being the main selling point. This would mark also the final appearance of CM Punk, who walked out of the company shortly after this. And despite the fact that his contract was extended all the way up to July, but he decided not to fulfill those obligations. So, he ended up leaving the company right before his contract would officially expire. It was also pretty notable for a lot of things that ended up going wrong for this show, which is kind of a sad reality, even, especially at that time and even looking back in retrospect. I'm going to get a little more into the Royal Rumble match as the video rolls along. I didn't watch this pay-per-view when it originally aired, so it wouldn't be until most recently when I started watching it on the WWE Network, just for the first time. So I don't necessarily have any experience watching this one from its original broadcast. So I don't necessarily have that kind of sort of nostalgia of it in a sense, but just looking back at this show and just kind of looking at it through not so much like rose-tinted glasses, or looking in the sense where, like, especially with this show and just, watching this, knowing what the outcome was going to be and just kind of understanding what the landscape of that, of the direction that the WWE was going through at the time. So it was definitely a very interesting show, even for all the wrong reasons. I mean, given the build-up frustration, especially when it came to some of the viewers watching the show, and especially the fans that have stuck by WWE ever since they were really little. And then you fast forward like here in 2014, given what's been going on, especially particularly being one superstar that's been all the talk of the town, going back to, the summer of 2013, and having a wrestler like Daniel Bryan, breaking out of his tag team run with Kane, being Team Hell No, and being supposedly looked as the weak link. But despite all the naysayers, Bryan proved the doubters wrong. He even played a huge part in ending the Shield's undefeated streak and being the guy responsible to contribute to that big accomplishment. Given his momentum, going over guys like Randy Orton and Sheamus, all these former world champions, and then SummerSlam 2013 rolled around, and so he's given this opportunity to challenge then world champion John Cena. And even despite Bryan's, winning the WWE title, it will only be a matter of time before that moment quickly gets taken away from by Randy Orton, who was, being the Money in the Bank winner. So using that briefcase to cash in and successfully win the WWE title. And with everything going on with Triple H being the referee and just playing favoritism and taking away Bryan's moment. I mean, that period from late 2013 and early 2014 was that kind of period where a lot of folks really kind of, they really wanted like the good guy to go over. And a lot of the times that wasn't the case. And just watching all those WWE television shows during that time, like whether it be Monday Night Raw or SmackDown. But it was definitely a very interesting time, and also at the same time pretty frustrating to watch as a viewer. Going into 2014, it seemed like there would be some bit of optimism with someone like Daniel Bryan, who by this point was succumbed to the cult that is the Wyatt family. Their alliance would go on for about a couple weeks or so, but that didn't last long. Eventually, Bryan breaks off from Bray Wyatt. They had that tag team steel cage match, and thus leads us into the match that opens up the show. So this was actually one match that really got the crowd rolling, and it was very competitive. And you had Luke Harper and Eric Rowan, who were accompanying Bray Wyatt at the time. So they were going at it early on. Bryan does a suicide dive over to the Wyatts, and Harper and Rowan are trying to do everything they can to stop Bryan from getting the advantage. And earlier on, they even try to interfere in some way to a point where the referee had no choice but to bar them from ringside. So the match continued on. Bryan and Wyatt are just slugging all over the ring and even a bit at ringside. Bray would get most of the offense, and there was actually a spot where he and Bryan were kind of duking it out on the ring apron, and Bray Wyatt just working on Bryan's arm for a bit. He does a massive senton splash onto Bryan from the concrete mat. There were some occasions where Bryan does fight back and even doing his traditional yes kicks and then following up with a knee to the back of the head of Bray Wyatt. There's a bit of psychology going on there as the match rolls along. Eventually, they came to a point where Bryan tried to go for a yes lock, but Bray successfully fights out of it. Bryan tried to go for another suicide dive, but Bray Wyatt counters it and then does the Sister Abigail and lands Bryan's head onto the barricade. So this kind of allowed Bray to roll Bryan back in the ring and get the 3 count. And eventually Bray Wyatt would successfully defeat Daniel Bryan in the process. This is definitely a really great match. And sadly, this would really be the only truly great match on this card, considering that the rest of the card from here on out takes a pretty big nosedive. Yeah, nevertheless, there was just some tremendous performances by the two competitors. We'll definitely see what happens later in that night, because this would not be the last time we would see the Wyatt family. And then we get to Brock Lesnar taking on the Big Show. Now, this match was basically over before it began, but it's pretty notable for the build-up leading the show, where Big Show and Brock were having these series of confrontations, and a lot of the times Big Show would be the one getting the upper advantage over Brock, and Brock just kind of at that certain situation that he's in, whether or not he could outsmart Big Show. Because it's kind of more like, even though he is smaller than the Big Show, they kind of had the announcers just kind of pointing it out and just kind of putting over this whole conflict between the two wrestlers. It's like whether Brock would be able to manhandle the Big Show. He can't take on Big Show with brute strength, but rather using strategy. Basically, this is not the first time that they've confronted one another. A number of occasions back in 2002, where they were fighting over the WWE title, and then Paul Heyman turned on Brock Lesnar and sided with Big Show, and costing Brock to lose the WWE title to Big Show. This was also the second time that they fought at the Royal Rumble, given that they fought 11 years prior to that. But unfortunately, unlike the 2003 Rumble, their encounter here at the 2014 Rumble was such a big letdown. Big Show made his entrance early on, and then Brock ended up attacking Big Show just before the ref could be able to ring the bell. So he's using chair shot after chair shots on Big Show, just kind of wearing him down early on in the match just to get a head start. Big Show does eventually fight back shortly after the bell rang. And even, when Brock was trying to hit Big Show with another steel chair, but Show counters back and hits the traditional WMD punch, the weapons of mass destruction. But basically the signature punch that Big Show normally does. Big Show is just trying to do everything he can to fight back, just trying to use whatever remaining energies that's left in him. But even despite that, Lesnar eventually outsmarts Big Show, hits Show with the F5, gets the cover for the 3 count for Brock Lesnar to go over. And after the match, Lesnar continued to beat Big Show down some more, even using the chair to his advantage. They even brawled at ringside for a bit, and even having him, particularly Big Show, having Brock Lesnar whipping Show to the steel steps, coming off the heels of a hard-fought bout between Bryan and Bray Wyatt. So you're kind of going from that match over to Lesnar and Big Show, which is kind of like, more of a segment, more than like a traditional wrestling match. And this is just kind of a way to put over Brock Lesnar, just to kind of keep him busy in preparation for his eventual high-profile match at WrestleMania. So this is basically more of a filler feud, and Lesnar did go over the Big Show in a pretty disappointing match. I mean, compared to the match that they had the 2003 Rumble, where there were stakes going on, like Lesnar had to do everything that he can to win back the WWE title that he lost unfairly, especially coming from a guy like the Big Show. So Brock had to beat Big Show in order to qualify for the 30-man Rumble that year, and Lesnar did eventually win that. The fact that there weren't really any stakes or anything that was on the line, I think kind of made this match meaningless. And it definitely really showed in this match. But, like I said, it was just to put over Brock Lesnar. But it just kind of felt like just kind of something to keep him occupied. And then we get to the WWE title match between John Cena and Randy Orton. Now, Orton had been champion since SummerSlam. But also there were occasions where the belt changed hands during that Orton-Bryan match at Night of Champions. But then they had to reverse the finish and state that title change never occurred. Ignoring that, Orton had been champion consistently since SummerSlam. And, he's beaten guys like Big Show, Daniel Bryan in the Hell in a Cell match. Beat John Cena for for their match that they had at TLC. And then they continue on that program that they had here at the Royal Rumble, only that this time this is just a traditional one-on-one match. And this is kind of really one of those matches where it's just so played out, and the crowd just completely rejected this match, and they just booed both of those competitors. I mean, there was really nothing new to this feud. Even in the build-up, the WWE was just trying way too hard to kind of try and tell us that Orton and Cena is the biggest feud ever. And it was so forced and just so manufactured. It was just very off-putting, especially for me as a viewer. And, given the fact that both Orton and Cena had fought countless times in 2009 to a point where they just, the crowd just wasn't going to have it anymore. Particularly the hardcore wrestling fans. And given that, being that they're in Pittsburgh, a very smarky town, and it just didn't help. The fact that being in a smarky town just kind of really hampers the match. The fact that, going back to what I was saying about the build-up, so there were moments where, I think there was, another angle where, well, not another angle, but another moment where Orton attacked John Cena's dad. We haven't seen that before, back in 2007. So it just kind of really felt like, they were just kind of rehashing some of the same stuff that, that we've seen, especially when it came to these two guys going at it. This match, I mean, they tried their best to, keep the fans' attention span going. Orton starting off with a couple rest holds. Cena just doing what he can to fight back. I mean, it's about as quick of a pace of a match that you could possibly have. There was occasions where they kept stealing each other's finishing moves. Orton did an attitude adjustment on the Cena. Cena kicks out. Cena does RKO on Orton. Orton kicks out. A number of occasions where Cena does his own STF, only to have Orton make a mockery out of that by stealing his STF signature move. Even the crowd reactions, I mean, there were folks just chanting Daniel Bryan, Daniel Bryan, Daniel Bryan. There was also some occasions where they were chanting for Chris Jericho, who I think wasn't even wrestling during this time. I think he had left like earlier that September, but wouldn't come back until like 2016. And then, they were also chanting Kurt Angle's name, considering that this was in his hometown. But I think he was still wrestling for Impact Wrestling at this time. So, he wasn't going to show up, even despite the fact that this, like I said, this was in Pittsburgh, his hometown. Yeah, so basically the crowd just completely hijacked this match, and they weren't having it. And then towards the end of the match, the Wyatts came out and interfered just when it looked like Cena had Orton beat. So Cena tries to fend them all off, but it backfires. Orton gets the advantage, hits Cena with the RKO for the 3 count in order to successfully retain his WWE title. And I also forgot to make mention that by this point, the 2 world titles that were on opposing brands, like Raw and SmackDown, were also unified at TLC. So that also another important thing that I almost forgot to make mention of. So yeah, the belt, as far as Randy Orton has, he's basically unified the WWE title and the World Heavyweight titles that were on SmackDown and Raw. By this point, the original brand extension had quietly phased out. Orton was basically the sole world champion, no questions asked. And it wouldn't be till 2 years later when they decided to reinstate the brand extension, where they have to introduce another top tier title belt, being the Universal title. Orton would still retain the title belt here, and he would continue to hold that belt for a couple months, and eventually losing it at WrestleMania 30. Nevertheless, Orton and Cena was just such a terrible match, even despite the efforts that both Cena and Orton did to kind of keep the crowd's attention span going. But I think people were just tired of seeing the same 2 guys just going at it at this point. Then we get to the 30-man Royal Rumble match, and man, this is pretty much the main course of the show. I will say, like, the match actually started off really good. I was really hooked into this match early on. I will say that. CM Punk started off at number 1, and number 2 would be Seth Rollins, who was representing the Shield at the time. So they were basically starting off the match by going at it. They would actually be in the Royal Rumble match for a good portion, at least like pretty much the Iron Man of this match. Like I said, I mean, the Royal Rumble match started off really good. The crowd was really excited. They were just, cheering for some of their favorite wrestlers. If you look at the talent pool, I mean, it was just very astounding, Obviously, CM Punk being in there, Seth Rollins, Cody Rhodes, before he would end up starting up his own wrestling company, and now it's, the number 2 wrestling promotion in the country. You got Antonio Cesaro, I mean, still in the company as of the time I'm uploading this video, but, Cesaro, who was still hot, basically one half of the Real Americans at the time. Kofi Kingston being the show stealer of the match. Kofi Kingston is, like, walking up the barricade, and, he hops on the apron, and then the crowd pops, and, he's back in the ring. He never got eliminated. Just traditional Kofi Kingston Royal Rumble matches where he's like doing everything he can to make sure he's not eliminated, that his feet isn't touching the ground in any way, shape, or form. This would also mark the unofficial debut of Rusev, who also shows up as one of the 30 contestants in the Rumble match. And he wouldn't make his official debut until I believe the Raw after WrestleMania 30. So this was definitely like a spotlight match for him, just to really showcase what he could be capable of on the main roster, even if it was just for one night. We also saw an appearance from Kevin Nash, who also showed up during this Rumble event. And it's very interesting considering that, Kevin Nash had even in the 94 Rumble, he had one of the most eliminations in a Rumble match that would eventually get, that record would be beaten by Kane. And then eventually Roman Reigns would end up beating Kane's record. So Diesel had 7, Kane had 11, and Roman had 12. So yeah, they were three of the notable wrestlers that competed in this match that were known for having the most eliminations in past Rumbles. Kevin Nash would eventually get eliminated. He wasn't in the ring for too long, but the crowd was still pretty excited for Nash when he came out to that NWO theme song. El Torito also came out. I totally forgot about Los Matadores, which was basically like a repackaged version of Primo and Epico. And so they had their little mascot, El Torito. I mean, the crowd was still pretty hyped for him. I mean, he wasn't there for very long, but he also got to showcase a little more in the ring, and and even had to confront some of the key important wrestlers that were in the ring at the time. So like, especially with like CM Punk, who's just kind of, trying to resist El Torito's offense, and then, Punk kind of underestimated Torito, so he ended up doing like a head scissors takedown on him. Eventually, Roman Reigns would eliminate El Torito. So then Batista comes out. So they have been making announcements that Batista was going to make his in-ring return at the Royal Rumble. He even had a return on Raw where he confronted Randy Orton in a segment that he was going to take his WWE title. And so Batista being the odds-on favorite to win the match. Unfortunately, as much as it on paper that Batista coming back would sound like a cool idea, but at the same time, it was an idea that a lot of fans really took criticism, especially like, given once they realized that Daniel Bryan wasn't going to be involved in the Royal Rumble match. By the time we hit the number 30, Rey Mysterio's music hit. The crowd was just completely drained, and they just completely rejected the match, kind of like what they did with Cena versus Orton earlier on. When Mysterio ended up getting eliminated, the crowd ended up cheering. And, I gotta admit, I kind of feel sorry for Mysterio. I mean, for all the shit that he's been given, ever since 2006, winning the World Heavyweight title, and being looked at as a charity case just because of, being the world champion because of Eddie Guerrero and his untimely death. So all the Eddie exploitation that was going on that surrounded Rey Mysterio's booking throughout 2006 kind of really had the fans sour on him over time. And it didn't help matters that being number 30, being the scapegoat, and having to have the fans completely boo Mysterio the way they did. Given that Mysterio, much like Daniel Bryan, both of them wrestled all around the world, and Mysterio making his big success in Mexico and his breakout role in WCW and then transitioning over into WWE. I mean, Mysterio's definitely done it all for the wrestling business. And, for, having Mysterio be like the scapegoat and the getting booed because, Bryan did not show up to compete in the Rumble match itself, I think really turned away a lot of viewers. Just when it looked like the Rumble match from the very start started off very promising, but then, by the end of the match, it's like, the crowd just wasn't having it anymore. But eventually it would come down to Batista and Roman Reigns. Roman was the, the go-to guy for a lot of the fans in the crowd that night. And even despite that, Roman did not win the match. He did get some offense on Batista. It looked like he was going to win. Batista eventually eliminates Roman Reigns and became the 2014 Royal Rumble winner. Even despite Batista being looked at as the babyface in this match, he ended up breaking character as the fans started booing him. And he's just telling the fans just to deal with it. I'm the 2014 Royal Rumble winner. And the show ends there, and he's pointing at the WrestleMania sign. I just can't really stress out just how heartbreaking it was just to see, or to kind of be one of those fans in attendance at the time, just waiting for my favorite wrestler to come out, only to find out he's not going to compete at all. And just getting, high expectations, high hopes for that matter. And then it just all falls apart like a bunch of dominoes. It was definitely soul-sucking, like, towards the end of the match. It didn't help matters that Batista, having just come back after a 4-year hiatus, being, like, bent out of shape. I mean, I think he ended up doing, like, a really sloppy spear. Having Batista win the Rumble like that, it was just so bad. I mean, I wish I could come up with a better synonym for that, but it was very clear that you had someone like Daniel Bryan, who a lot of folks have been cheering and chanting his name for months and months and months. If you look back at the Raw leading into TLC, like, Cena and Orton was supposed to be the sole focus. And then you all have the entire WWE roster standing in the middle of the ring and being in the background, supposedly being supportive over this Cena-Orton match and how important it was supposed to be. But even despite that, the crowd kept chanting Daniel Bryan's name. And then they would do a similar thing again in that steel cage match when Bryan and Bray had the match with the Usos. And the crowd was just so marking out like crazy. I mean, that Baltimore crowd that night in that steel cage match was completely dead for most of that night. But then you get to that moment where Bryan turns on Bray. It's like the crowd just went crazy again. And it was just such a 180, just hearing the crowd and just having them chant in unison and really being supportive of Bryan. It just definitely boggles my mind, just even to this day, as to why WWE did not, take notice of that and just say, oh wait, Bryan's really over. Let's put him in that Rumble match, But unfortunately, that was not the case that night. And it would take until social media to really get the WWE, especially with their board of directors and their booking committee, to kind of, take under consideration to try to rectify that issue. They had to come up with this whole Yes Movement segment as an excuse to get Bryan in the WWE title contention. It's so weird to judge this match. I mean, it's not as bad as, the following year's Royal Rumble, especially with the way they were booking it. I think if Bryan had competed in this match, if he had showed up later that night and be one of those participants involved, maybe like in a Becky Lynch kind of way a couple years later, where like Lana was supposed to compete in the match, but then she had to opt out. So then they had Becky Lynch take over for Lana and then winning the Rumble that way. I mean, I think a lot of people were expecting that kind of moment, like maybe have like Becky Lynch moment that they ended up doing, but I mean, over the years, WWE definitely took notice of this criticism. Maybe not next year's Rumble, but the Rumble after that in 2016, and then going forward, I think they've somewhat taken notice of that. But yeah, I mean, this Rumble match is just going to be one of those matches that people are going to remember, even for the wrong reasons. But I won't lie, there was definitely some things to like about this Rumble match. It was definitely one of those shows that you just kind of look back and you're kind of wondering, it's like, why they didn't go in this route, or why didn't this guy compete in this match? And especially when it came to the storylines and the direction that they were going. That's really my thoughts on the 2014 Royal Rumble event. What are you guys' thoughts are about this pay-per-view? And feel free to comment down in the comment section below. Were you guys there in attendance when all that was taking place? And what were your guys' reactions when you found out that Bryan didn't get to compete in the Rumble match that night? I mean, feel free to leave down your comments down in the comment section below. Thank you all guys for watching, and until next time, this is Jimmy signing out. Take care, everyone.